Ever wonder if a country's history, like it can impact how well it's doing economically today? Does the past cast a long shadow?
Interesting question.
We're going to deep dive into that, looking specifically at the impact of colonialism.
Yeah, that's a question economists have been wrestling with, like, forever. It's a big one.
To help us unpack it all, we got two really important pieces of economic research. First up is this groundbreaking 2001 paper by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson.
You'll probably hear them called AJR a lot.
Exactly, AJR. And then we'll dig into a 2012 critique by David Alboe that really kind of takes their findings to task a little bit.
It's a great example of, how economic research gets better, through debate and analysis.
For sure. Okay, so AJR. Their argument is pretty bold. They say that the way Europeans colonized the world, still has this huge impact on global income inequality today.
Yeah, they basically say that in places where Europeans, actually settled and set up strong institutions, like think fair legal systems, property rights, those places ended up with this lasting economic advantage.
So setting the stage for success, basically.
Yeah, and on the other hand, where Europeans didn't settle as much, they set up what they called extractive institutions, right? So think of a company coming in, just taking resources and then leaving.
They're not invested in the place actually growing long term.
Exactly.
So, okay, what makes the difference between those two approaches then? Why'd they settle in some places and not others?
Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. AJR says it boils down to, wait for it, germs.
Germs? You mean diseases?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Diseases. They looked at how many settlers were dying from diseases, mortality rates, and they said that was a key factor. Where Europeans were getting hit hard by diseases, they weren't immune to, they were less likely to settle, more likely to do that extractive thing.
Makes sense, I guess. If we can't live here easily, might as well just take what we can.
Basically. And AJR, they saw this playing out big time in the Americas.
Oh, right. Like how European diseases, smallpox especially, devastated the native populations in the Americas.
Exactly. And that led to a way more extractive kind of colonization, especially in South America. Think conquistadors, focused on gold and silver. Not exactly long-term thinkers,
But in North America, where Europeans weren't dying as much, they did the whole, more inclusive institutions thing, which, AJR would say helped lead to the economic growth they saw later on.
Right. It's a pretty stark comparison.
Yeah.
And that's why their work had such a big impact. They were saying that geography, because it influences disease and how colonization happened, played a huge role in how wealthy nations are, even centuries later.
So it was like a ripple effect through time.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this groundbreaking theory linking disease, colonialism, and modern economics.
Enter David Alboe,
our data detective.
He takes a closer look and, well, finds some issues.
He's like, hold on a second. Your data isn't as rock solid as you're making it out to be.
Yeah, and what he found raises some serious questions about, the foundation of AJR's whole argument.
Okay, so spill the tea. What'd he find?
So Alboe, he goes through AJR's data, right? 64 different countries. And he notices something. Reliable mortality rates, the ones taken from within a country itself, those were only available for 28 countries.
Wait, so more than half their data wasn't even from the actual places?
Yeah, so for the other 36, AJR had to extrapolate, using data from nearby countries, or making educated guesses about what the rates might have been. Not exactly precise.
Not exactly.
He called them conjectures, which, is a nice way of saying, how can you make such big claims based on guesses?
Right. It's like assuming the weather in California is the same as Arizona just because they're both kind of southwesty. You're going to be wrong sometimes.
Exactly. Alboe's point is that disease environments, they can be totally different even within one country, let alone across many. He used the example of Mali, where AJR used a single mortality rate from a French military campaign and then applied it to 6 different countries.
Which they probably weren't all exactly the same in terms of disease.
Right, making the data, well, unreliable.
Okay, so that's not great. Anything else?
Oh, yeah. Alboe also wasn't a fan of how AJR handled the data, specifically how they grouped different mortality rates.
Like what do you mean?
They lumped together the death rates of soldiers who were on active campaigns, where disease spread super fast because of the conditions, with soldiers who were just stationed in barracks back in Europe.
Those are wildly different situations.
Right. It's like comparing apples to oranges.
Totally.
Soldiers on campaigns, they were exposed to way more risk, so their death rates were obviously higher than the average soldier.
Let alone like a regular European settler just trying to build a life.
Right. And remember, AJR's whole argument depends on the experience of those settlers. If the data on that experience is messed up, well,
The whole thing kind of falls apart.
yeah.
So what happened when Albuquerque corrected these data problems? Did it totally disprove AJR?
Well, it definitely made things less clear. When he used AJR's model, but with the corrected data, that link between settler mortality and institutions, it got way weaker. And in a lot of cases, it became statistically insignificant.
Statistically insignificant. For those of us who don't speak statistics, what does that even mean?
It means the connection wasn't nearly as strong as AJR's research made it seem.
Like, not enough to say one thing caused the other definitively.
Exactly. Throw some doubt into the mix, you know?
Okay, so it's not that AJR was totally wrong.
It's that it's more complicated.
Way more complicated.
Exactly.
So we went from, like, this big groundbreaking theory about geography and institutions to, well, maybe not so fast.
Right. It's not always a straight line from A to B.
What does this all mean for us then? You know, someone just trying to understand the world today.
I think it reminds us that data, even when it seems really powerful, you know, it isn't always clear-cut. Even the best researchers, they can make mistakes. Data can have problems. And even how we interpret things can be skewed.
It's like, don't believe everything you read,
Yeah.
even if there's a fancy chart. Right?
Exactly. We got to be critical, a little skeptical, you know, especially with tough issues like colonialism and global inequality.
Because if we just take these big, sweeping explanations as fact, we might miss important stuff.
All right.
Other explanations.
Totally. And we could end up with some really bad policies.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if we based development aid just on what AJR initially found.
We might ignore countries that, like, their model says are just doomed to struggle.
Yeah, based on their geography and something that happened, like, ages ago.
And that's not even getting into how this could lead to prejudice.
Right, like those stereotypes about certain regions being predisposed to extractive institutions.
Just because of their past.
Exactly. It's reducing really complex history to a single thing, and it's just not that simple.
Okay, so if we can't just point at settler mortality rates and say, that's it, what other stuff should we be thinking about with global inequality?
Well, we can't forget about the institutions and cultures that were already there. Like, AJR's model kind of treats colonized societies like blank slates, and no, they had their own governments, trade, social structures, all that was there before Europeans showed up.
Right, right.
And those existing institutions, they probably had an impact on how these societies dealt with colonization, how they developed after. Some might have had systems that were, like, more adaptable, while others, you know, faced way more disruption.
It's like expecting all plants to thrive in the same soil, even if they have different needs.
Exactly. We also have to look at what happened after independence. Just because a colonial power left, it doesn't mean their influence just vanished.
Right? A lot of former colonies, they stayed economically dependent on them or had political instability. Often because of the former colonizer. It's like the past isn't really past, is it?
Exactly. Those post-colonial experiences, the politics, the policies, they all played a part in shaping where a country ended up.
So it's like a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
Historical stuff, geography, internal policies, global dynamics. All of it matters.
And that's what makes it so interesting to study. No easy answers, you know, no magic formula.
Right. Okay. So if we're trying to actually do something about global inequality today, what's the focus? Is it like fixing past wrongs or...
Well, it's not really one or the other. We can't ignore the legacy of colonialism, but we also can't act like it's the only reason for a country's struggles.
So it's about looking at each situation, each country's history, and what's going on now.
Yeah, it's about understanding the nuances.
Okay, so no easy answers, but recognizing that complexity is important. This deep dive's really got us thinking.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
But before we, let our listeners go off and ponder it all, is there a final thought we can leave them with? Something to really hit home why all this matters.
What if AJR's data was never challenged? How would their findings, even though they were compelling, have changed how we see things like development aid, investment, even how we view different parts of the world?
Whoa, yeah. Makes you think about how much weight a single study can have.
Right, and why it's so important to have people checking the work, debating it. Like, we could have ended up with policies based on a mistake.
Instead of helping with, like, poverty or infrastructure, we'd be like, well, they were just destined to struggle because of this thing from ages ago.
Exactly. And then that kind of thinking, it's almost like it becomes true just because you believe it.
A self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. You don't invest because of the past, so then, of course, they keep struggling.
It's like saying someone's a bad runner because of their genes and then never even letting them try out for the track team.
Exactly. You're ignoring their potential, and you might even make them believe those limitations are true.
This deep dive has really shown how we got to think critically about everything, especially with big important stuff like global inequality.
Absolutely. We can't just accept whatever sounds good, ask questions, look at things from different angles. There's rarely just one reason something is the way it is,
For sure. And that's something we can all do, right? It's not just for academics and experts.
Totally. Be curious, dig a little deeper. Don't be afraid to question what everyone else says.
Love that. Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least.
Tons to think about.
For our listeners who want to learn even more, we'll link to the AJR paper, Albui's critique, all that good stuff in the show notes.
Always more to learn. Keep digging.
Yes. Until next time, happy learning, everyone.